There's a photograph that survived. It shouldn't have, but it did. 30. One children standing in 3 uneven rows outside a farmhouse in rural Massachusetts. Not one of them is smiling. Not one of them is looking at the camera. Their eyes are fixed on each other, only each other, as if the photographer didn't exist at all, as if the rest of the world had already vanished. The back of the photograph is dated 1947, and written in faded pencil are 4 words that no one in the family will explain. The last gathering together. What the photograph doesn't show is what happened inside that house. What it doesn't capture is the silence that wasn't silence at all. The hums, the clicks, the guttural sounds that only they understood. 30. One siblings born over 20. 3 years to the same mother and father, and not one of them could hear a human voice. Not their parents, not a doctor's, not even their own, but they could hear each other, and that's where this story stops being about deafness and starts being about something else entirely. Hello everyone. Before we start, make sure to like and subscribe to the channel and leave a comment with where you're from and what time you're watching. That way, YouTube will keep showing you stories just like this one. This is not a story about disability. It's not a story about resilience or community or the triumph of the human spirit. This is a story about isolation so complete it created its own reality. About a bloodline that turned inward until it stopped resembling anything the outside world recognized as family. About children who grew up believing that sound itself had 2 separate languages, the one their parents used to communicate with strangers and the one they used to communicate with truth. The family name was Carver. Thomas and Miriam Carver. Between 1924 and 1947, Miriam gave birth 31 times. 30 times the child was born profoundly deaf. Once, just once, a baby was born hearing. That child died 6 weeks later. The official cause was listed as failure to thrive, but the Carver children had a different explanation. They said the baby heard too much, that the world outside was so loud, so violent, so full of lies that the baby's body simply gave up trying to translate it. The neighbors said the Carvers were cursed. The doctors said it was genetics. The church said it was God's will. But none of them could explain why the Carver children thrived in ways no isolated, profoundly deaf community ever had. Why they built their own language faster than linguists thought possible. Why they looked at hearing people the way we look at ghosts, like something tragic that didn't know it was already gone. Thomas Carver was a cabinet maker. Miriam Carver was a schoolteacher before the children came. They married in 1923 in a small ceremony outside Worcester, Massachusetts, and by all accounts they were unremarkable. Thomas was quiet, methodical, good with his hands. Miriam read poetry and kept a garden. They wanted a large family. In 1923, that wasn't unusual. What happened next was, the first child, a boy they named Samuel, was born in March of 1924. He didn't cry, not when he entered the world, not when the midwife cleaned him, not when Miriam held him for the first time. At 6 months old, he still hadn't responded to his name. At 9 months, Thomas clapped his hands behind the baby's head. Nothing, no flinch, no turn. Samuel was profoundly deaf, and the doctors told them it was rare but not unheard of. 1 in 1,000, they said, a tragedy but an isolated one. The second child, a girl named Ruth, was born 14 months later. Also deaf, the doctors were surprised but reassured the Carvers that coincidences happen. Genetics can be cruel in ways we don't yet understand. They suggested the couple stop having children. Miriam and Thomas refused. They believed in God's plan, they believed in family, and perhaps, underneath it all, they believed that the next child would hear. The 3rd child was deaf, so was the 4th. By the time the 5th child arrived in 1929, the local doctor stopped coming to the house. He told Thomas privately that whatever was happening in their bloodline was beyond his understanding, possibly beyond medicine itself. He suggested Miriam see a specialist in Boston. She refused. She was pregnant again. Here's what the records don't tell you. Miriam never seemed surprised, not after the third child, not after the fifth. There are letters preserved in the Massachusetts Historical Society, written by Miriam's sister, that describe visiting the Carver home in 1930. She wrote that Miriam moved through the house like a woman fulfilling a prophecy, not suffering a tragedy. She wrote that the children, 5 of them by then, all under the age of 6, had already developed a way of communicating that looked like choreography. Hands moving in patterns that weren't American Sign Language, weren't any formal system at all, something they'd invented themselves. The sister wrote one more thing. She said she asked Miriam why she kept having children when she knew what would happen. And Miriam looked at her with an expression the sister described as not quite pity, not quite contempt, and said, "You think they're the ones who are broken." By 1935, there were 11 Carver children, all deaf, all developing this private language that even linguists who later studied it couldn't fully decode. The farmhouse had been expanded twice. Thomas had stopped taking commissions from town. The family had begun to seal itself off, not out of shame, but out of something closer to sovereignty. They didn't need the hearing world anymore. They had built their own. By 1938, there were 17 Carver children living in that farmhouse, and something had begun to happen that no one outside the family could adequately explain. The children had developed a communication system so complex, so rapid, so utterly foreign to anything documented in linguistic research that the few academics who observed it left more disturbed than enlightened. It wasn't American Sign Language, it wasn't home sign, it was something else entirely, a hybrid of gesture, facial expression, tactile touch, and rhythmic movement that seemed to operate on rules only they understood. But here's what made it truly unsettling. The Carver children claimed they could hear each other, not in the way hearing people understand sound, but in some other register of perception that they insisted was more real, more true than auditory noise. When researchers from Boston University visited in 1940, they documented something they called synchronized response patterns. One child would begin a gesture on one side of the room, and before it was completed, a sibling 30 feet away would respond, not to the gesture itself, but to the intention behind it, as if they were sharing thoughts across a medium the researchers couldn't perceive. The children described the hearing world as the flat place. They said hearing people only perceived one layer of reality, the surface layer made of sound waves and spoken lies. They said their parents lived in the flat place, and that's why Miriam and Thomas had to use written notes and exaggerated gestures to communicate with their own children. But amongst themselves, the Carver children said they experienced something they called the underneath, a place where meaning moved without distortion, where truth couldn't hide behind tone or inflection or the violence of the human voice. One researcher wrote in his notes, "They pity us. I have never seen deaf children pity hearing adults before, but the Carvers do. They look at us the way we might look at someone who has lost their sense of smell, aware that we are missing something, but incapable of explaining what we cannot perceive." Thomas and Miriam had become strangers in their own home. By 1941, there were 23 children, and the parents had been effectively exiled to the edges of family life. They still provided food, shelter, discipline when necessary. But the emotional center of the household had shifted entirely to the children. Mealtimes were silent to hearing observers, but erupted in frantic communication amongst the siblings, hands moving, eyes locked, bodies swaying in rhythms that seemed almost ritualistic. Thomas and Miriam ate separately. They slept in a bedroom on the first floor, while the children occupied the entire second story in a communal arrangement that violated every norm of privacy and individuality. Neighbors reported hearing sounds from the Carver house at night, not voices, not crying, but low, resonant hums that seemed to come from multiple sources at once, vibrating through the walls. When asked, the children explained that they created vibrations together, pressing their hands to the floorboards, their backs to the walls, humming in frequencies they could feel in their bones. They said this was how they dreamed together, how they shared memories, how they became, in their words, more than 30, but less than separate. The town began to call them the Silent Choir. It was meant as a kindness, a way of romanticizing what people didn't understand. But the children hated the name. They said there was nothing silent about their world. They said the hearing people were the silent ones, stumbling through the flat place, mistaking noise for meaning, alone inside their own skulls, terrified of the underneath where all the real conversations happened. In the spring of 1946, Miriam Carver gave birth for the 30th time. She was 44 years old. Her body had been pregnant for a cumulative total of nearly 20 years. The midwife who attended the birth later told her daughter that Miriam didn't scream, didn't cry out, didn't make a sound, as if she too had learned to live in the underneath, where pain was just another frequency to be absorbed and translated. The baby was a girl. They named her Abigail, and like all the others, Abigail was born profoundly deaf. The 29 siblings gathered around her in those first weeks with a focus that bordered on reverence. They passed her from lap to lap, placed their hands on her chest, hummed into her skin. They were teaching her the language, welcoming her into the underneath. By 6 weeks old, Abigail was already responding to their gestures with a precision that shouldn't have been possible. The Carver children said she was the quickest learner they'd ever seen. They said she understood things even they were still discovering, but Miriam was pregnant again. Number 30, one was coming, and this time something felt different. The children knew it before anyone else. They became agitated in ways the parents had never seen. They stopped sleeping in their communal arrangement and instead took turns staying awake, hands pressed to Miriam's belly, faces tight with something that looked like dread. When Thomas asked them what was wrong, they signed a phrase in their private language that he couldn't understand. Later, a researcher would translate it. It meant, "The flat one is coming." In November of 1946, Miriam gave birth to a boy. They named him Daniel, and Daniel could hear. For the first time in 22 years, a Carver child was born with perfect, undamaged hearing. He cried like hearing babies cry, loud, piercing, impossible to ignore. The sound shattered something in that house. The 29 older siblings recoiled from it. They covered their faces, pressed their hands over their eyes, retreated to the farthest corners of the rooms. It wasn't that the sound hurt them. They couldn't hear it. It was something else. They said later that Daniel's presence created a distortion in the underneath, that where he existed, the truth couldn't move properly, that he was a hole in the fabric of their shared reality. Miriam tried to nurse him. Daniel latched and fed and seemed healthy, but the other children wouldn't come near him. For the first time in the family's history, a Carver child was isolated. Daniel slept alone in a cradle in his parents' room. He was the only one. Thomas tried to bring him upstairs to be with his siblings, but the moment Daniel entered their space, all 29 of them turned their backs in perfect synchronization. Not out of cruelty, out of something closer to self-preservation. Daniel lasted 6 weeks. On January 4th, 1947, Miriam found him dead in his cradle. No signs of trauma, no illness. The doctor listed it as sudden infant death syndrome, a term that meant nothing more than "we don't know." But the Carver children had an explanation. They said Daniel had been trying to live in 2 places at once, the flat place and the underneath, and that a soul can't survive that kind of splitting. They said he heard too much, that the violence of sound, the lying frequencies of the hearing world, had simply overwhelmed him. They said it was a mercy. Thomas buried Daniel in the family plot behind the house. Miriam never spoke his name again, and the 29 remaining siblings held a ceremony that night that no hearing person was allowed to witness. They gathered in the largest room of the farmhouse, formed a circle, and hummed together for 3 hours straight. Neighbors a quarter-mile away reported feeling the vibrations in their floorboards. One described it as the saddest sound she'd ever felt, even though she couldn't actually hear it. After Daniel's death, something fundamental shifted in the Carver household. Miriam stopped leaving her bedroom. Thomas began spending entire days in his workshop, building cabinets no one had commissioned, furniture that would never be sold. The children, now 30 in total, ranging from newborn Abigail to 23-year-old Samuel, began to exhibit behaviors that alarmed the few outsiders still permitted near the property. They stopped acknowledging the existence of hearing people altogether. When the doctor came to check on Miriam in the spring of 1947, the children looked through him as if he were made of glass. When he tried to examine one of the younger ones for a persistent cough, she didn't resist or comply. She simply remained motionless, her eyes fixed on her siblings across the room, her hands moving in slow, deliberate patterns. The doctor wrote in his report that it felt less like being ignored and more like being erased. He said the children had decided that hearing people were no longer real, and reality had rearranged itself to match their belief. The town council held a private meeting in June of 1947. There were concerns about the children's education, their socialization, their future. Massachusetts law required school attendance, but the Carver children had never been enrolled. Thomas had convinced the local board that Miriam was homeschooling them, but no one had verified this in years. A truant officer was dispatched to the farmhouse on a Tuesday morning. He knocked for 10 minutes. No one answered. He could see faces in the upstairs windows, multiple faces, all watching him with expressions he later described as curious but not concerned, the way you might watch an insect trapped under glass. He reported back that the family was unreachable, possibly dangerous, definitely in violation of state education requirements. The council debated intervention. But here's the thing about small towns in post-war Massachusetts. They had bigger problems than a family of deaf children who kept to themselves. The factories were closing. Men were coming back from Europe with injuries no one knew how to treat. The Carvers weren't bothering anyone. They paid their taxes. Their property was clean. And Thomas Carver had powerful friends in the church who quietly suggested that some families were best left alone. So they were left alone, and the isolation deepened. By autumn, the children had begun refusing food prepared by their parents. They would only eat what the oldest siblings prepared, as if anything touched by hearing hands was contaminated. They stopped wearing the clothes Miriam sewed. Instead, they fashioned their own garments from bedsheets and curtains, simple tunics that looked almost monastic. They stopped using furniture the way it was intended. Chairs became platforms for their silent ceremonies. Tables became stages for their gestural performances. The house itself was being transformed into something that served their reality, not the reality of the flat place. Thomas found his youngest daughter, Abigail, sitting alone in the kitchen one morning. She was 11 months old, too young to walk steadily, but she had crawled down the stairs by herself, something that should have been impossible for a child her age. She was sitting in a shaft of sunlight, her hands moving in patterns so fast and complex that Thomas couldn't track them. He realized she was practicing, rehearsing the language, alone, as if even at 11 months old, she understood that mastery of the underneath was the only thing that mattered. If you're still watching, you're already braver than most. Tell us in the comments, what would you have done if this was your bloodline? Thomas tried to hold her. Abigail tolerated it for exactly 10 seconds, then pushed against his chest with surprising strength. She wanted to go back upstairs, back to the others, back to the only place she believed was real. Thomas carried her up the stairs, and the moment they reached the second floor, all 30 children turned to look at him at once. Same angle, same expression, as if they shared a single awareness. He set Abigail down, and she crawled immediately into the center of the group, and they closed around her like water. Thomas understood then what Miriam had understood years earlier. They had not given birth to 30 children. They had given birth to something singular, something that wore 30 faces, but thought with one mind. And it no longer considered them part of itself. Section 6. The photograph and the departure. The photograph was taken on September 19, 1947. Thomas hired a photographer from Worcester, a man named Ellis Hartman, who specialized in family portraits. Thomas told him it was for Miriam's birthday, a gift to remember all the children together, but that wasn't the truth. Thomas knew something was ending. He could feel it in the way the children had begun moving through the house like a single organism preparing to molt. He wanted evidence, proof that they had existed, that this had been real. Ellis Hartman arrived at noon. He set up his camera in the yard behind the house, positioned his tripod, arranged his equipment. Thomas went inside to gather the children. It took an hour, not because they refused, but because they moved as a collective now, and collectives don't respond to individual commands. Eventually, all 30 of them emerged. Samuel, the oldest at 23, carried Abigail, who was just over a year old. They arranged themselves without instruction, 3 rows, perfectly spaced, as if they'd rehearsed it. But they wouldn't look at the camera. Alice asked them repeatedly to face him, to acknowledge the lens. They ignored him completely. Instead, their eyes were locked on each other, some looking left, some right, some at the person in front of them, creating a web of attention that excluded the photographer entirely. Ellis took the picture anyway. He said later that he'd never felt more invisible in his life. He said it was like photographing a species that had evolved beyond the need to acknowledge observers. After Ellis left, Thomas developed the photograph himself in the darkroom he'd built in the basement. When it emerged from the chemical bath, he understood why the children had posed that way. In the photograph, if you trace the lines of their gazes, they formed a pattern, a geometric shape that mathematicians would later identify as a specific type of network topology used in advanced communication systems. The children hadn't been randomly looking at each other. They'd been mapping their connections, showing the outside world the structure of the underneath. Thomas wrote 4 words on the back, the last gathering together, because he knew. He'd known for months. 3 days later, on September 22nd, Thomas woke to find the second floor empty. All 30 children were gone. Their makeshift clothing was left behind, folded neatly on the beds. The sheets they'd been using for their ceremonies were arranged in a circular pattern on the floor of the largest room, weighted down at the edges with stones they must have collected from the property. In the center of the circle was a note, written in Miriam's hand, but signed with 30 thumbprints. It said, "We have gone to where the underneath touches the surface. Do not follow. We are not lost. We were never yours." Thomas called the police. A search was organized. Over 200 volunteers combed the woods surrounding the Carver property. They searched for 3 weeks. They found nothing, no footprints, no signs of passage, no evidence that 30 people, including a 1-year-old baby, had walked through the dense Massachusetts forest. It was as if they had simply evaporated. One search party reported something strange on the 4th day. They found a clearing about 2 miles north of the Carver house where the ground was warm, not hot, but noticeably warmer than the surrounding earth. The grass, in a circular pattern, had been flattened, and when they placed their hands on the ground, they said they could feel a low vibration, like the humming of distant machinery. By the time they brought investigators back to the site the next morning, the warmth was gone. The grass had sprung back up, There was nothing to document. The official investigation concluded that the children had likely been victims of foul play, possibly kidnapped, possibly murdered, though no bodies were ever found. Thomas and Miriam were questioned extensively. Both passed polygraph tests. Neither had an explanation that satisfied the authorities. Miriam said only one thing to the lead investigator: they went home. When asked what she meant, she wouldn't elaborate. The case remained open for 7 years, then was quietly archived. The Carver children were declared legally dead in absentia in 1954. Thomas died in 1959 of heart failure. Miriam lived until 1972, spending her final decades in near-total silence, tending a garden that grew larger every year. Neighbors said she planted 30 trees in the back acreage, one for each child. Every evening, she would walk among them, her hands moving in patterns no one recognized, as if she were still speaking to them, as if she believed they could still hear her from wherever they'd gone. The farmhouse stood empty for 11 years after Miriam's death. No one wanted to buy it. Real estate agents said potential buyers would tour the property and leave within minutes, claiming the air felt wrong, too thick, too quiet, even for an empty house. One family made it as far as signing paperwork before their daughter, who was 7 years old, refused to enter the building. She said there were too many people inside. When her parents insisted the house was empty, she became hysterical. She said they weren't people exactly, but they were there, and they were waiting for something. The property was eventually sold to a developer in 1983, who tore down the farmhouse and built a small subdivision. 4 homes now stand where the Carver family once lived. Residents of those homes report unusually high rates of vivid dreaming. Several have described the same recurring dream, standing in a circle with people whose faces they can't quite see, communicating without words, understanding everything, and being understood completely. They wake feeling a profound sense of loss, as if they've been expelled from somewhere they belonged. In 1991, a linguistics professor from MIT named Dr. Catherine Wren published a paper analyzing the Carver children's communication system based on the limited documentation that survived, mostly observer notes and a single 8-minute film reel shot by a researcher in 1941. Dr. Wren concluded that what the Carver children had developed wasn't merely a language, but a completely different cognitive framework. She argued that their brains had reorganized around a form of perception that hearing individuals may be neurologically incapable of accessing. She called it collective proprioception, the ability to sense not just your own body in space, but the bodies and intentions of others as extensions of a single distributed consciousness. Her paper was rejected by 3 major journals before being published in an obscure quarterly that ceased publication 2 years later. Academic colleagues said her conclusions were too speculative, too willing to accept the supernatural testimony of frightened observers. But Dr. Wren stood by her analysis. In an interview before her death in 2008, she said the Carver children had accomplished something humanity wasn't ready to understand. They had opted out of individual consciousness and into something older, something that existed before language separated us from each other and from the truth. There have been reported sightings over the years. In 1963, hikers in the Berkshires claimed they encountered a group of adults communicating in rapid, silent gestures, moving through the forest with unnatural coordination. In 1978, a night watchman at a closed textile mill in western Massachusetts reported seeing maybe 20 or 30 people standing in a circle in the abandoned factory floor at 3 in the morning, all of them perfectly still, all of them facing each other. When he approached, they turned to look at him in unison, and he said he felt something he described as a force, like being pushed by air. He ran. When police investigated, They found nothing. In 2003, a woman named Claire Dennison came forward claiming to be the granddaughter of Ruth Carver, the second born child. She said her grandmother had returned to the hearing world in 1976, alone, and lived under an assumed name until her death. Claire said Ruth never explained where she'd been or why she'd come back, but that she'd told Claire one thing before she died. We built a place where the lies couldn't reach us, but I got lonely. I was the only one. The others are still there, and they're happy, and they'll never leave. Researchers tried to verify Claire's claims. No records exist of a Ruth Carver living past 1947 under any name. Claire provided a photograph she said was her grandmother at age 60. The woman in the picture had the same distinctive bone structure as Ruth Carver from the 1947 photograph, but dental records couldn't be obtained for comparison. Claire herself disappeared in 2006. Her apartment was found empty, her possessions left behind, her phone and credit cards never used again. On her kitchen table was a handwritten note that said only, "I finally understand where she went." The photograph, the last gathering together, still exists. It's housed in the Massachusetts Historical Society archives, available for viewing by appointment. But something strange happens to people who study it too long. Archivists have reported that researchers sometimes fall into trance, like states, staring at the image for hours, tracing the lines of the children's gazes with their fingers. One graduate student had to be physically removed from the archives after spending 6 consecutive hours looking at the photograph without moving. When asked what she'd been doing, she said, "I was trying to see what they were seeing. I almost did." The truth is, we don't know what happened to the Carver children. We don't know if they died in those woods in 1947, or if they found something the rest of us are still searching for. We don't know if their language was a disability compensated for, or an ability that hearing people lack. We don't know if they were 30 separate souls who learned to think as one, or one soul that learned to wear 30 faces. What we do know is this: Thomas and Miriam Carver brought 31 children into the world, and 30 of them decided the world wasn't where they belonged. They looked at reality as hearing people constructed it, full of sound and fury, signifying noise, and they said no. They built their own underneath, and then they went there, and they never came back. The question isn't whether they're still alive. The question is whether they ever died at all, or if they simply found a frequency the rest of us can't tune into. A place where 30 voices still speak as one, where the flat place can't intrude, where the only truth is the truth you can feel vibrating through your bones when you press your hands to the earth and hum in unison with the only people who ever really understood you. They're still out there, somewhere beneath the surface, still speaking, still listening, still waiting for the rest of us to stop shouting into the void and start feeling for the underneath. And maybe if you're quiet enough, if you stop trusting sound and start trusting silence, you'll feel them too.